Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Martin O'Riordan, and I'm the General Manager and Head of Cybersecurity at Mercury IT. With me today is our Chief Information Security Officer, Chris Haigh.
Hey, everyone.
Today, we are going to talk about something that possibly we've also discussed why we're even talking about it. So Chris and I have mentioned this before. We're talking about ransomware. And we named this particular webinar our new normal. Now, kind of like the fact that we are in webinars is kind of our new normal as well, but
absolutely.
Ransomware has been around for quite some time. Some of the first examples came around in 1989, and we have seen sort of that exponential growth over the years. And certainly, Chris, would you agree that the real growth of it started when cryptocurrency became available?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we saw it at the end of 2013 started to really ramp up because it was easier to get the money, I guess, without getting caught.
Exactly, and that's why probably at that time I think we all thought it was going to go away. We saw certainly in that early period we saw businesses getting hit with ransomware on a weekly basis, like it was a common occurrence. Then we saw some of our technical controls improved, and we saw that kind of decrease a lot. I think we thought it was going to go away.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely did. I must say our technical controls helped a lot. So, and we'll certainly talk about those technical controls that we've had in place. Because I'd say since we've had that in, I mean, I don't think we've seen a ransomware event in any of our managed fleet for probably 3.5, 4 years. So yeah. It's certainly been effective.
It has, and I think the reason we're talking about it today is because it's still in the news quite often, and
absolutely.
Certainly we're seeing a real growth in ransomware attacks. I guess one of the real changes with the ransomware attacks were around the fact that they didn't just encrypt the data; they kind of exfiltrated it and then decided they would almost blackmail people to try and get them to pay the ransom.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a development that had to move on, because I think where they got to is they were like, hold on a second, they're actually not paying. What they're doing is they're just restoring from their backup if they've got one. So there were kind of two tactics there. They ramped up the encrypting the backup. So that was a new thing. And then the other one was actually doing the blackmail, but they're actually taking a copy of the data and then doing that. And I think that started way back as well, 2015. We started actually seeing that change come in, which I think was the Crimea one, where they actually said, hey, we will release this publicly if you don't pay.
Yeah, and I think there's been a few really high profile examples recently. I mean, we've got one up there now, which is the Toll Holdings, which was last year, but certainly it was a prime example because they got hit twice, didn't they, Chris?
Yeah, it was twice in a few months, and I think they had barely recovered from the first one, and then kind of had to start again. And it took them up to 6 weeks to restore all the systems. Look, there was a lot of systems to restore, so you kind of get that. And it's certainly something that we'd need to mention. I mean, in this case, they were just restoring from their backups. They didn't actually pay the ransom in this case, which was good. It just depends. And I guess at the end of the day, they didn't disrupt the entire business. There were bits of it. I think the tracking specifically was disrupted. But yeah, so I mean, every business is different.
It is, and we are going to touch on around that whole ransom paid, because I know that that's also been a little bit topical at the moment, is that the government are talking about how they can stop businesses from paying the ransom. So that's something we're going to sort of touch on after we just run through a couple of these high profile cases. This is the Nine Entertainment, which they were disrupted in their actual delivery of their services, which is
it's quite a big one. Very, very big one. I mean, it's actually quite concerning as well about, whether it was just a phishing attempt or a little bit more. You can imagine a kind of a government entity, so state-sponsored entity taking over a news outlet is a little bit concerning.
Well, that's always been one of those components of a coup, isn't it? Is take over the media. So, obviously that could be just one of those test cases.
Absolutely.
So, look, we're not going to go into too much detail on some of these. I think that a lot of them people have seen in the news already, but it does disclose something where a lot of the businesses that we have seen, especially in Australia, are not disclosing whether they've actually paid the ransom or not. One of the things that I know that the government is now talking about is putting into some kind of legislation where it compels you to disclose if you've paid the ransom. But we'll talk about some of that a little bit later as well.
Absolutely.
So overseas, we did see the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack, and the company chose to pay the ransom. Was that because it was going to be longer to restore the backups? Was that one, Chris?
Yeah, all the backups had a problem. I'm not too sure. I know there was a government kind of agency that eventually paid. It was like some city council that got done, and they started doing their restores, but the restores were going to take weeks versus paying the ransom and having it unencrypted within a few minutes or hours. So I think they were in the process of restoring, but then ended up paying anyway to get up and running. The Colonial Pipeline, I certainly thought was a good one to bring up. It was an interesting one. They shut down their IT network because they were concerned about the OT network, so their operational technology network. So they were concerned about the actual management of the pipeline, the gas, the etc. That they were shipping, and they were concerned that the ransom attack on the IT environment would actually leak over to the OT environment and become a very serious disaster, which is why they actually shut it down. And there was no specific reason for them to shut down the OT. It was just purely a protection mechanism in case something happened. So I suppose it goes out just as a note that both can be affected, and we are actually seeing a lot more attacks take place on the operational technology. So it's certainly something to look at. And when we say operational technology, you might not be a Colonial Pipeline or something, but just think there's a lot of like HVAC systems that are controlled by your IT environment now as well. So, your heating, cooling for a building, things like that. And, I think we were joking the other day, if it's a case of like, well, we could just lock the building and not give you access, that is a problem, right? So it's kind of a real world denial of service attack.
And that is the thing, because a lot of the operational technology, devices are not quite as robust in their security footprint than a lot of the other aspects of our internal IT. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And you'll see the government stepping in there as well, where they're starting to actually legislate that these suppliers and manufacturers are actually putting decent passwords onto systems instead of default. Just think about things like home-based routers and that kind of stuff. They're starting to lock down on that. Similar is solar is another one where it's connected to your IT. Again, like quite often there's very weak passwords.
And we've also talked about, because you just mentioned about the suppliers. So certainly one of the things that we've talked about is that the whole infrastructure chain, and there have been a lot of attacks where they've gained access to a much larger corporation or government through a contractor or a supplier. And
absolutely.
How do you think we should be starting to lock down that entire chain of the IT chain? We've for a long time we've had logistics chains, but how are we starting to lock down that IT chain?
Look, it's always been there. I think it's whether businesses actually take it seriously or not. And that's always my concern, is a lot of businesses won't, or they don't have the time, or they don't have the budget, or whatever it is. So if you look at any kind of infrastructure, kind of architecture to protect it. So if we look at NIST as an example, as a framework, right? So that's a cybersecurity framework. Your chain or supply chain is in there as well. Now, the government has obviously taken steps with that. If they've got contractors, they expect them to have, for instance, like the ASD Essential 8 in place, or even be assessed. So IRAP assessments, etc. For depending on what they're doing and what part of contracting they're doing for the government. But what you'll find, I was speaking to a lawyer the other day, and they were saying that it looks like there's legislation coming that probably isn't too far away, where the government's actually going to start to legislate or mandate that critical infrastructure actually starts to meet these requirements as well. And it's a lot of things that you might not necessarily think that you part of the critical infrastructure, but certainly hospitals, schools, and power, including solar, and any companies running solar farms will quite possibly have to meet government guidelines to be able to trade. So,
yeah, and certainly that food supply chain as well is like the next example where we saw it.
Absolutely, this was huge.
And they paid the Bitcoin ransom because they were shut down for quite a period of time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that was a big one.
And that sort of comes into where we start thinking about, are businesses doing enough to actually prevent some of these attacks or be able to respond quickly? I know that the government in Australia in particular has already started talking about a ransomware payments bill. What we do know, it's a little bit sketchy at the moment, but what we do know is that over time the government will do something to tighten this up, because the problem continues to be perpetuated by the fact that we seeing that the criminals are becoming more and more advanced. They keep adapting, and I don't know that as businesses are businesses adapting fast enough to respond.
Yeah, probably not. And I think that's why this sort of this public consultation has started. So it's looking at governments looking at what they can actually do to start looking at this. Because what was the loss last year? Just over $2 billion?
Yeah, just over $2 billion in Australia alone.
Yeah, which is insane. So businesses certainly need to do something. And we'll see with the notifiable data breach stuff, they haven't actually issued any fines out of that. So it's kind of like, yeah, it's a bit, and there's been some substantial breaches from businesses, and they still haven't kind of slapped any fines out to anything. Look, we don't know the background; they won't give us everything, but it just seems unusual that it's been in since 2018. I remember when the commissioner even did their last report, they were warning that fines were coming, because I remember reading that as well, and still nothing. So it's an interesting one.
It is. So I guess that sort of brings us into some of the things that we could be doing to prevent and respond to ransomware attacks.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, there's quite a few things. So we'll run through what they are. I was actually showing you a website just the other day. It was an American-based one, but I mean, it's ransomware. This was from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and they actually released their ransomware guide. It was a little while ago now, but they've got a dedicated website and that to it as well, which I thought was quite interesting. There's some good steps. It's the stuff we generally would talk about anyway, but it's good to be able to send out. So I think if people are interested, we could certainly send the link out to that site and to that PDF as well.
Yeah, that sounds good. So I think where we start with is we always talk about people, process, and technology as being the three pillars. So the ransomware sort of response and prevention really do fit into that model too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if we look at people, always an interesting one, and it's generally one that I'll always bring up, and that's around actually training your staff. It's super important. Even if you take a look at something basic like, you should have a incident response plan in place. Has that been communicated and trained correctly out to staff as well? So as opposed to this document sitting somewhere that no one's seen.
Which happens quite often with policy, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And we go back through those policies with our clients once a year. Just make sure they're up to date, and I'll reiterate: has this gone out to staff? Send it out again. Make sure everybody has seen it and is aware of it. But on top of that, you do need a robust training plan, so a cybersecurity awareness program in place. And there's some great ones out there. I mean, we use KnowBe4. Absolutely love the platform. It's brilliant. I know there's lots of others out there as well. It's just the one I've got the most experience on. We've been using it for over a year. massive platform, good load of content, constantly updated almost on a monthly basis, in fact. And whether that's videos, there's games, there's etc. to actually train people around the basics of cybersecurity. And then, of course, phishing simulations are huge.
Yeah.
So if we look at one of the main vectors for ransomware, it's phishing. It's way up there. It's very, very high. And it's that coming through that email looking just like totally legitimate, and somebody clicking on a link and off you go. Look, there's a couple other steps in there of preventing that, but it's certainly how it can happen. And all of a sudden we're off on a ransomware attack.
And that the KnowBe4 platform also gives that baseline, so you can actually see where you are, and you can actually track the improvement of it as well. So obviously, start understanding.
It's actually got a lot of reporting. I think it's got over 60 reports that you can use. So it's absolutely fantastic for the board, because it can actually show your risk factors and like your phish prone percentage actually coming down over the months as people are trained. And on top of that, it can actually automate the phishing for you as well. So the simulated phishing, because they introduced an AI into it a few months ago, and I think we were talking about it the other day. It's getting really, really difficult to spot. But that's great, because then our staff and our customers and that use it start to actually get trained and they get their eye on what they're actually looking for. So I think it's a brilliant system. So that pretty much covers off the people part of it.
And we I know we go on about the people part quite often, but it really is one of the areas that is just not focused on enough across the world, but certainly in this country, where we just see that weakest link is still the person clicking, the clickers. So,
I know, which is terrible, because it doesn't have to be your weakest link. It could be your absolute strongest link. It's that first line of defense at the end of the day. So if you've got people that are trained, it's certainly your first line of defense. And then if it gets past that, because invariably it will get past, then you've got your technology and your other steps that have got those pieces to actually help out as well. So I think that's pretty good.
Yeah. So I think we could probably run through a couple of those, the technology parts that would actually help prevent.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, from a process perspective, we've already mentioned the incident response plan. The only other one I'd add to that is probably patching as a process as such, because a lot of those ransomware events took place because the patching happened too late. So quite often, the Microsoft will release a patch, and then somebody gets hit with ransomware, and it's because they didn't patch, the patch release that came out 3 months ago or 6 months ago. So it's staying up to date with that. That's important. But we talk about like infection vectors in this, and how it's actually going to come in. Now, we've spoken about one of the biggest ones, which is phishing already, but another one is internet-facing systems. So if you've got, let's say, if you still host your own email server, I know a lot of people are on O365, so that's kind of going away, but you might have remote desktop services, you might be hosting your own website, you might be hosting a VPN concentrator. There could be a number of things that are internet-facing within your organization that do need to be tested. So there's two things I've mentioned there, is patching, obviously, is the first one. And then the second one would be regular vulnerability assessments. I mean, you could take that one step further and you can actually do full pen testing as well, but just doing a regular vulnerability assessment on it is a good idea. There's a lot of systems that can actually automate that, so it could be quite useful.
Absolutely. And that's where, you start to think about some of the other things that should be in place to try and prevent some of the other vectors that are coming through. So you've obviously got email, so that's obviously a big factor.
Absolutely. So you're going to need to look at some sort of filter there. We use Cisco's filter specifically, but again, there's lots of other ones out there that you could use that are good. And as long as you're using one, I think is the important thing. But even Microsoft's one, if you get their extended license, the higher end license to enable it, so basically the advanced kind of malware protection you can switch on, on the systems for O365, so to get better protection. So that's not just phishing detection and quarantine, but that's obviously your malware, virus, etc. as well from that point. So it's kind of that entry point, and you're trying to filter that entry point firstly, and then go from there.
Well, one of the things
come through.
Yeah, and one of the things that we've found that has worked quite well is that the DNS protection.
Yeah, DNS protection has been huge. We started using OpenDNS many years ago, and then that got bought by Cisco as well. So they renamed it to Umbrella. I would say that's probably one of the biggest things that we've had in place that has prevented ransomware. Because it's not like it just goes away. There's lots of attempts, like hundreds of attempts per week across our fleet. Now, whether that's coming via email, so managers get past a filter, or it's coming from a website and it's been downloaded, etc. You could have that malware actually detonate on the machine and run. It might not be detected by your endpoint security, whatever you're using. Like, let's say it might be something that's relatively new or bypasses for whatever reason. But a lot of the ransomware to actually encrypt the files has to connect out to a command and control server. So it's got to get the key to actually do the encryption. And that is generally where it gets stopped. So as it does that DNS lookup, again, not all malware uses DNS as a lookup, but over 90% does. So it's quite effective in stopping ransomware actually getting to the point of encrypting the files. So that's an interesting one. So yeah, I would say the umbrella protection has been very, very good. Again, there are other ones out there. It's just the bundle we use with Umbrella, but it has been super effective.
Yeah, and obviously you have to have endpoint protection.
Yeah, the endpoint protection is huge. There's some really good ones out there. We use Cisco's endpoint security, was formerly AMP. That's been very effective. Like I said to you earlier, since we've had this bundle in place over the last 4 years, we haven't actually seen any attacks. Again, there's always attempts, but they do get stopped. So, but you'll notice there's the standard thing that we always talk about, which is a defense in depth. It's not just the endpoint security we've got in place. It's the DNS protection, which with Cisco Umbrella, it's not just DNS protection, it's intelligent proxy service as well. So even browsing out onto the internet and the site looks a bit dodgy is going to be proxied through these proxy services to protect your endpoints. Now, you might have a proxy on site that does that as well. And of course, we spoke about email filters coming in. And of course, you got your firewall as well. And generally, your firewall is going to be the newer type firewall. So basically a next generation firewall. So that's generally got intrusion prevention systems and it's looking for malware signatures, etc. But you'll note there's all these steps. It's not just this one thing. It's not I just have a proxy or I just have DNS protection or I just have endpoint protection. You do have to have all of it together because, and I'll say it again, even though you've got all those things, you could very well be hit with ransomware. If you get a 0-day through, I would say in Australia, we might be a little bit luckier in that, like a lot of the big ones tend to hit in Europe and America first, and then systems get updated before it hits this side sometimes. So maybe we've got a little bit of a reprieve there, but 0-day does exist, which is why you have to have your incident response plan. And the other technology bit that we talk about is backups.
Yeah,
like that's one of the main ones. So
and it's not just about having a backup. You've got to be able to test it. You've got to be able to check it. And are companies doing fire drills? How long does it take to restore from their backup?
That would be my biggest concern, is the restore time. We were working with one of our larger clients who's got backups in place. They use Veeam and etc. But they were actually concerned about how long it would take to actually restore. So they actually put in a secondary system for the backup that kind of almost took like snapshots of the backup. But this was like 10 gig connected and then also had a system that could actually make it immutable. And what that means is if you've got a backup that's online, right, so it can be seen on the network, ransomware could actually go through your system and through the backups as well, where this system had the immutable flag set, so it can't actually be encrypted or changed for that matter at all. And what this allowed is to actually have the restore take place at absolute lightning speed. So being able to stand up golden images, for instance, we spoke about having a gold image of critical systems so that you could actually stand these up very quickly. I think the other point we mentioned was, do you have hardware to restore to?
Yeah.
That was the only other thing.
Yeah, if you talk about that, because,
cool.
Yeah, because a lot of those instances where they paid the ransom was not because they didn't have the backup. It was about the time it was going to take to restore.
Yeah, like if you're down for weeks at a time, and if you've never done the restore, you're going to get that typical thing, right? The business is going to go to the IT and say, how long is it going to take to restore? Now they're going to go, I don't know, or I've just kicked off the restore and that little counter is telling me 28 days.
Yeah, so we're not here in 28 days, right?
That's part of the problem.
And that is, really highlighting the fact that, the IT team is critical in this. And now, are they given the support from the business to be able to do what they need to be able to do to prevent and respond to an incident like this?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think it's from a plan perspective, the stuff that we've actually gone through with regards to backups, having your incident response plan actually documented, tested, and people actually know it. And then looking at those infection vectors that we're speaking about. So internet-facing systems, making sure patching, vulnerability assessments, looking at phishing is a big one. So training your users is absolutely huge. And it's not actually a big cost either. It's really pretty low cost as far as I'm concerned. And I'd certainly get that in place. Simulated phishing attacks is a good one to train your users. Next generation endpoint protection and response capabilities in place. DNS protection, proxies, your updated firewalls, so the latest. Absolutely important. The only other thing that we haven't really touched on, and I'll only touch on this briefly, is looking at, again, your supply chain. And that might be a case as if you are outsourcing your IT. That's certainly something to look at. And it is important. I mean, certainly we're an MSP, so we're responsible for those backups for our clients. So obviously we take that super seriously, and we work with our clients on that as well. And then that's something you would need to do as well. If your backups are outsourced or something else is outsourced, think about anything that's critical in your infrastructure and then go and ask some questions, I think. For instance, an MSP certainly should have an incident response plan. So
absolutely. And I think that really highlights, when you're choosing, who you use, is doing some of those due diligence parts to it, is finding out, do they take it as seriously as that they're telling the customers?
Yeah, absolutely. Agreed.
And I think that also just highlights, the importance that can also help in outsourcing, because sometimes you can outsource to, if you've got a small internal team and you think about how, stretched the resources can be, being able to outsource it to someone that has got a lot of depth in their team, that can also be a big benefit as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And something very important I've mentioned, because we see it quite often as well, is don't think because you've outsourced it, it's not your responsibility. It really is. You have to work with your MSP or whatever you're outsourcing, whether that's your developers or whatever it is. It's absolutely critical. You can't kind of go like, okay, I've passed that off and it's not my problem. There's definitely a shared responsibility there, and it's making sure you're having those meetings and that understanding of who's responsible for what. Very, very important.
Yeah, absolutely. And that having that clear lines, communication lines, reporting lines, responsibility lines is really imperative in making sure that, if this does happen to you, that you actually are, prepared for it.
Yeah.
So we're just mindful of time. So, we've spent our 30 minutes running over this. It's not a lot of time to go over this. Chris and I did talk the other day saying we could probably spend a couple of hours just talking about this.
Yeah.
But just in mind of time, so if anyone has any questions that you'd like to ask, if you could pop them into the chat section for us now so that we can possibly go through them for you and see if we can answer any of your questions. We may not be able to, we might have to take some offline, but certainly we'll give it a go.
Yeah, I see there is one question talking about air gap for the backup. That is a good idea. So if you don't have a system that I mentioned where it's got those controls that are immutable, and I looked at 3 different vendors that actually do this, and they've been tested against ransomware and making that backup as an immutable system. If not, then air gapping, and you can do that really, really like low tech as well. You can have a drive on site that's been backed up to and then taken off site. We've got some of our smaller customers that would still do that. There's lots of ways of doing it.
Yeah, exactly. So certainly, we've talked about how you do that offline backup process and how you actually protect it. So there are, as you said, there's a lot of different ways of doing it, but still so important.
Yeah, agreed. Cool.
Any other questions that anyone has?
No, I see someone has put in, Robert Katz has put in some other suggestions as well, which are all great. So I like the prevention is key statement, I think is the key one.
Prevention is key. It's like a lot of things in life, isn't it? Where if we can't prevent it, we end up with a lot of response. I mean, we're in that space now with COVID, aren't we? Where we can't prevent it, so we're in a response cycle that continues to impact businesses going forward. Whereas if we can prevent it, that certainly makes the argument that we're going to try and make quite a different one.
Yeah, definitely. And it is a bit sad sometimes where you see businesses will start allocating budget to the cyber side of things after the attack has taken place. That's a bit sad as well. I kind of feel like that's changing quite a bit, and I don't know if it's helpful, like with the news and etc. And you'll find that the board is starting to go, hold on a second, we kind of need to do this because we can't afford to be down for 28 days. What are we doing to actually make this happen? So I suppose as long as they're listening to whatever the advice is from external and IT and etc. of what funding is required to actually put all these controls in place. Like I said, defense in depth and prevention is definitely better.
But that is a really key point. We have talked about the fact, and we haven't mentioned it a lot in this one, but when we're talking about cybersecurity, that the people who own cybersecurity for a business are actually at the top. It's the board, it's the CEO, it's certainly right at the top. They need to be having the conversations around cybersecurity constantly. It needs to be a regular agenda item on their board meeting.
Well, it becomes quite a risk, right? At the end of the day. So you'll see there's an email on screen there as well. If you do think of any other questions, let us know. And like I said, we'll send through the link with that PDF on the ransomware controls. There's a lot more detail in that document, not specifically prescriptive, but we'll certainly give you an idea. If you do want to book a chat with myself or Martin, please feel to reach out as well on that email. Absolutely no problem. We are more than happy to have a conversation with you, a session, and just go through some of your stuff. We do have a cybersecurity roadmap that we actually use that will assess where we are with regards to the cybersecurity maturity for your organization and what the next steps are. So if you are interested, please do reach out. Yeah,
thanks, Chris. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Just a reminder that we are able to share this presentation with you. So if you want to go through it again, that's certainly available to you. And look, and thank you for joining us. We look forward to having some more in-person events coming up when we can. And
when we can.
When we can, and be able to certainly network with you. These webinar type situations are really good, just a good fill-in for us. But yeah, we are keen to get back face-to-face with everyone. Basically, look, stay safe. If you've got any questions, let us know. Otherwise, we'll look forward to seeing you next time.
Awesome. Thanks for coming, guys.
Thank you.